The lights were bright, the kind that blind you more than they illuminate. I stood behind the velvet rope, not on the guest list, just the one who paid for it. Her name echoed through the auditorium, polished and pronounced perfectly by the host. On stage, everyone clapped. I didn't, not because I wasn't proud, but because I still remembered the look on her face when I helped pin the tag on that second-hand dress. She said she couldn't afford a loan. I was the one who filled out the application, paid the registration fee, even rushed to the post office the day it almost missed the deadline. I was the one who helped her get here. But now, all I could do was stand still while people whispered beside me, "Is that her mother?" Only for her to glance over from the spotlight, wrinkle her nose ever so slightly, and say it loud enough for those near her to hear. "She's embarrassing. No name, no title, just that. As if I was something to hide. Something she'd rather uninvite from this version of her life." I didn't blink. I just smiled. The kind of smile that saves a person from crying in public. Because even if she didn't want to be seen with me every step she walked to that stage, was paid, quite literally, by the woman she just humiliated. And maybe she didn't know it, but someone else in the room did. The man beside me, the event director, slowly turned to glance at me. Then, at the papers in his hand. I wasn't listed as guest, because I had signed them as sponsor. I held onto the laminated program they gave me at the door like it was proof I existed there. Her name was printed in bold, followed by a sentence that listed her as a finalist, one of the top contenders. For the scholarship, for the award, for the applause, and mine. Not even a mention, but I didn't need it. I had the receipt folded in my purse. The one that confirmed the payment went through the week. She forgot her wallet. I had the screenshot of our text messages where she said, "I'll pay you back right after the ceremony." I never asked her to. I just wanted her to stand there, proud of herself, and maybe, just maybe, say thank you. But when the cameras turned, she turned too. Her eyes swept past me like I was a janitor who wandered in by mistake. I wasn't dressed like the others. No heels, no makeup. Just me, in my cleanest clothes, with my hands folded and heart cracking. The woman beside her wore glitter and satin. Someone introduced her as her mentor. I almost laughed. Because the only mentorship she got was watching me skip my shifts to pick her up from rehearsals. I could have shouted it all right there, told everyone the truth, but instead I walked away, quietly, proudly, because she might have erased me in front of the crowd, but she couldn't erase my sacrifices. And something in me whispered, people forget who lifted them, but the ground never does. And I had carried her, barefoot, up every step of that stage. I stayed until the very end, standing near the back where no one had to look at me. When they called her name, the audience erupted. People clapped like she'd moved mountains all on her own. She bowed, smiled, waved, and I watched, clenching the edge of my seat. The announcer thanked the mentors, the sponsors, the faculty. But when her turn came to speak, she glanced at the crowd and said, "I got here by pushing past everything that held me back." That was the moment, my moment, that shattered. She didn't just forget me, she erased me, as if I had been the thing holding her down, not the one lifting her up. I looked around, half expecting someone to say my name, to mention the single mother who worked double shifts to pay for every lesson, every dress, every ride, but silence answered louder than applause. And then I heard it, whispered behind me, "Isn't that her mom?" Followed by another voice, "No, I think that's just someone from the school." That's when I knew my love wasn't the kind that people saw. It wasn't shiny or loud, but it was stitched into every thread of the dress she wore, into every fee I paid without her asking, into the choice I made every single day to show up for her even when she didn't want to see me. I walked out before the lights came on, not because I was ashamed, but because I refused to clap for the version of her that forgot the truth. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a dozen notifications. Her photo was everywhere, posing with the award, surrounded by cameras, tagged by journalists, and praised by friends. The caption she posted read, "Built this life with my own hands." No mention of the woman who sewed that dress after work, who borrowed money to cover the hotel stay for the ceremony, who skipped meals so the entry fee could be wired in time. I stared at the screen, not in anger but in quiet disbelief. She had rewritten her story with such precision that I didn't exist in it anymore. In the comments, someone asked if her family had been there. She replied, "It was a solo journey." That line didn't just sting, it unraveled something inside me. I wasn't angry for being excluded from a caption. I was devastated because she'd buried me while still needing everything I gave. I thought about how I'd packed her suitcase with tissues, painkillers, and the good luck charm her grandmother once gave me. I thought about how I ironed that gown under a flickering kitchen light while she slept in. None of that fit her new narrative, I suppose. In her world now, I was invisible and inconvenience, maybe even a reminder of where she came from. But in my world, she was still the little girl with skinned knees who used to run into my arms without shame. And no post, no speech, no caption could take that away from me. I didn't respond to the post. What would I say? That the glitter she wore came from sacrifices I never asked her to repay? That behind her flawless makeup and designer heels was a mother who hadn't bought herself a new coat in 5 winters? I kept scrolling through the comment sprays from strangers, hearts from old classmates, a message from someone saying, "You inspire me." I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. Inspiration, was that what I'd become? A silent backdrop to someone else's curated success? That night, I sat at the same kitchen table where I'd helped her fill out the award application. My hands still smelled faintly of fabric glue from fixing the hem of her dress. And as I looked at the worn-out wallet where I kept the receipt for her entry fee, I realized I didn't need her to thank me publicly. I just wanted her to remember, truly remember, that her path hadn't started in luxury, but in love. Not in isolation, but in hands that held her steady long before she could balance on her own. Maybe someday, when the spotlight dims and the applause fades, she'll look back and see the shadows that carried her. And maybe she realized those shadows were mine. I wanted to believe she'd come around, that maybe the lights, the nerves, the pressure had made her say something out of character. But the next morning, as the clips from the ceremony flooded social media, I saw it in crisp detail. Her standing in front of the press wall, camera bulbs flashing, saying confidently, "I got here on my own. No one paved the way for me." My heart stopped. I replayed the words over and over, hoping I'd misheard them, but the caption read the same. No help, just hustle. I thought of the part-time jobs I took when her scholarships didn't cover everything. The nights I skipped dinner so she could take extra lessons. The worn coat I kept wearing through 4 winters so she could walk into that show in something new. None of that fit her new version of the story. She needed to look like she came from nowhere and rose to the top untouched, and in her new world, there was no space for a tired woman with scraped knuckles and cheap shoes in the front row. I wasn't just forgotten. I was deliberately removed. I sat at the kitchen table watching her words get shared and celebrated, and I didn't feel anger, just an aching hollowness. Like watching someone tear down a house you built with your own hands, brick by brick, and say it was always theirs. I whispered to myself. She didn't have to lie, but maybe she thought she did. To matter more in a world that never saw women like me. The silence in the apartment grew heavier after that. Not because she called less, she'd already stopped months ago, but because something inside me shifted. I stopped checking her social feed, stopped waiting for the occasional text that never came. Instead, I sat with my own memories, replaying the quiet victories we'd shared before the cameras, before the gowns, before she learned to be ashamed of where she came from. I remembered her in that tiny community theater, barefoot, twirling. In a paper crown I stitched for her. Back then, she would run off stage and ask, "Did I make you proud?" And every time I answered yes, because her joy was mine. Because every smile she gave the world was something I helped build. Now, she didn't ask if she made me proud. She just made sure I wasn't in the picture. I tried to rationalize it. Told myself she was navigating a world that demanded polish, perfection, distance from anything that smelled like struggle. Maybe that's how she survived in it. But the woman who once held my hand backstage now pretended not to see me across the lobby, and that stung more than any insult ever could. I wasn't waiting for applause. I didn't want credit. I just wanted her to remember that someone stood behind her every time she stumbled. Didn't leave, but maybe that's the problem. People forget the ones who never left. They remember pain, drama, obstacles, but not the quiet love that paid the bill, pressed the dress, and waited in the back row. Smiling like they were center stage, I stayed until the end of that awards night, though I knew no one would acknowledge me. I watched her accept the trophy with trembling hands, her voice perfectly polished, her smile flawless for the cameras. To everyone who believed in me, she said into the mic, and I stood still by the back wall, just out of frame, holding the very shoes she used to rehearse in when we couldn't afford new ones. The ones I'd patched so many times, she once joked they had more thread than leather. I clutched them like a keepsake, not out of delusion, but because they reminded me of a time when she still needed me, maybe even loved me. Now she passed by like I was one of the staff, and extra in a story I helped write. No thank you, no glance, not even a nod of recognition. I heard a woman near me whisper, "Who's that standing alone?" And I smiled, politely answering, "No one." That's what I'd become. No one. Invisible, quiet, irrelevant. But I wasn't angry. I was heartbroken. There's a difference. Anger screams. Heartbreak waits in silence, hoping something will change. I had given up vacations, sold jewelry, worked extra hours in jobs I never mentioned just so she could feel like the world was within reach. And now, that world had swallowed her whole. I didn't blame her for chasing her dreams. I just never imagined I'd become the thing she'd have to erase to get there. But even so, I stayed. because I wanted to see her win, even if it meant watching from the shadows. After the applause faded and the crowd dispersed into cocktails and flashing lights, I stepped outside into the cold air, still holding the crumpled program and her old dance shoes. My hands ached from standing so long, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. I watched through the glass as she posed with donors, hugged her mentors, and toasted strangers with champagne I couldn't afford. A man bumped into me and apologized, asking, "Are you one of the organizers?" I almost laughed. In a way, I had organized her life, piece by piece, year after year, holding it together with pins, patience, and paychecks that barely made it to the end of the month. But I simply shook my head and walked away. I took the long route back to the station, the shoes wrapped in tissue in my bag, and sat on the bench beneath the blinking timetable. Around me, life moved, students laughing, couples embracing, others returning from their own small victories. I sat there, unnoticed, and let the sting settle. I had thought that maybe, just maybe, she'd look for me after the ceremony, that she'd peek through the crowd, spot my coat, and run to hug me like she used to. But some stories don't get that ending, and some mothers, especially the quiet, behind-the-scenes ones, don't get to be part of the final chapter. Still, I waited just a bit longer on that bench, watching every figure that passed, hoping one might turn back. None did. And so, with slow steps, I carried myself home, heart full of memories she no longer remembered. The following morning, I found the envelope on the kitchen table. It was addressed to her, stamped from the award committee, and had been rerouted through my return address because, as usual, she'd used mine for all her applications. I hesitated, staring at it. The irony made my stomach turn. I had spent weeks writing those recommendation letters, editing her personal statement, even paying for the portfolio to be printed and mailed. I had used my own printer, bought ink, late at night, and skipped meals to afford express shipping, and now here it was, a congratulatory packet. Sealed and triumphant, delivered to the woman she was so quick to disown in public. I placed it gently back down. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew what it said. She was accepted, of course. Full scholarship, invitation to the national showcase. Everything she'd wanted, everything I had helped her reach. Later that day when she returned, she didn't mention the night before. No apology, no glance. She grabbed the envelope, smiled to herself, and said, "They spelled my name right this time." I nodded, pretending I hadn't heard the embarrassment in her voice when she looked at me under the spotlight, pretending I hadn't heard her whisper, "She's just my mom. Don't worry about her." And still, I asked if she wanted dinner. Still, I offered to iron her blouse for the next event. Because sometimes, love isn't proud. It just waits, quietly, for someone to realize it's always been there, even when it's no longer wanted on the stage. She didn't say thank you, Nat. For the dress I stitched by hand, not for the registration fee I covered with my last paycheck. Not even for the makeup I gently applied while her hands trembled from nerves. Instead, she stood in front of that auditorium crowd, basking in applause, and let them believe it had all been her. When someone asked who she was with, she replied, "Just came, solo, keeps me focused." I stood in the corner, pretending I wasn't the woman who drove 6 hours in silence so she wouldn't miss her rehearsal. I stood clapping, pretending I hadn't stayed up 3 nights straight, sewing every bead onto the gown she was now twirling. In she danced, posed for pictures, received compliments on her elegance, and I saw her glow in a way I once prayed she would. But that glow came with a cost, a rewriting of history that erased me completely. At the end of the event, when the crowd had thinned and the balloons deflated against the floor, I reached out to help her carry her trophy case. She looked at my hands, then past me and called for a staff member to assist. I was left standing there, holding my breath and the shawl she'd forgotten on her seat. I don't know what hurt more, that she didn't acknowledge me or that I still hoped she would. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't scream. They just ache, quietly, in the smallest acts of erasure, and somehow, even in that silence, I still loved her more than I thought a heart could bear. I waited until we were alone in the parking lot, hoping the stars or the quiet night might soften whatever had hardened between us. I held out her ones she begged me to keep in my bag because they hurt less than the heels, and she took them without a glance. "You didn't have to come," she muttered, her voice flat, almost embarrassed by my presence now that the cameras were gone. I opened the car door for her, just like I used to on the first day of school, but she slid in without a word. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter than they needed to, because somewhere in that silence I felt like I was disappearing. As we drove, I glanced at her through the mirror. She was wiping off the lipstick I bought, texting someone, probably, thanking them for being there. But not me. Never me. When we got home, she walked inside ahead of me, trophy in hand, and I followed like a shadow. Before heading to bed, she turned slightly and said, "Don't make a big deal out of today, okay?" Then her door clicked shut. I stood there alone in the hallway, still holding her heels, her shawl, and every quiet sacrifice I made so she could feel seen tonight. But I wasn't seen, not once. I placed everything gently by her door, like I always did, because part of love, I suppose, is doing things without being asked, and sometimes never being acknowledged. And still, I'd do it all again if it meant she'd feel proud, even if I was the price she paid for that pride. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, as always. There was glitter on the living room rug, remnants of the night she'd remember as her big break. I made coffee quietly, as if afraid even my footsteps might embarrass her now. The paper lay unopened on the table, but I knew she wouldn't care about headlines unless her name was in them. I sat on the couch, scrolling through the official photos of the award show, trying to spot even a hint of myself in the background. Nothing. No trace of the one who drove, paid, waited, clapped, and prayed. Not even in the group photos. I hadn't been invited to stand beside her, and now I wasn't even in the memory. Just as I was about to close my phone, I saw a comment under her post. "So proud of you. You did this all on your own." She had liked it, hearted it, actually. And I just sat there, letting that tiny red icon burn through the screen like it had been aimed at my chest. No correction. No mention of the entry fee. I paid with what little I had left in my account. No caption about the mother behind the camera. I got up slowly, legs stiff from hours of waiting in cheap heels, and walked to her room. The door was open just a crack, and inside she was asleep, trophy on her nightstand. I closed the door gently, not out of spite, but to hold on to what little dignity I had left. Some people raise stars and get swallowed by the dark. I spent the rest of the day sorting through old receipts, scholarship forms, photos from school plays, bus tickets, and letters of recommendation I had once begged for on her behalf. They were all tucked in a single box I used to call my proof of love. As I laid everything out on the dining table, I realized how invisible effort becomes when people only look at the spotlight. That dress she wore stitched with my own, hands bead by bead after work. That speech she gave rehearsed with me late into the night, even when my eyes burned from exhaustion. Every part of her success had my fingerprints all over it, yet I was now treated like a stain to be hidden. I found the email confirming her award submission, and I remembered how scared she'd been to apply. "What if I fail?" she had whispered, and I had answered, "You won't, because I believe in you more than anyone ever will." Now, her silence screamed louder than any rejection letter. No, thank you. No mention. Not even a glance at the woman who made it possible. I looked at the entry confirmation once more. My name was there, clearly visible in the payment section. I took a pen, wrote "paid in full" across it, and slipped it into a plain envelope. Then I walked to the fireplace, took a breath, and tossed it into the flames. Not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed proof. She had already burned the bridge herself. I was just watching the ashes settle quietly with grace. When I left the venue, no one followed me. The spotlight stayed inside, along with the applause I had paid for. But outside, under the street lamp, I felt something different. Freedom. I sat on the bench at the bus stop, still in my dress, still wearing the shoes I had polished just for her. In my purse, I had a single item left. The letter from the foundation that would now receive the scholarship donation I had intended for her graduate studies. I had rewritten the name the night before, just in case her words at the show matched the emptiness I'd been feeling for months, and they did. "You're embarrassing," she had said without a blink, without hesitation, as if the years had been erased in a second. So I erased her name just as fast. I gave the grant to a young woman I'd met at the public library, who studied by the vending machines because she couldn't afford a desk lamp. When I handed her the envelope earlier that day, she cried like someone who had just been told she mattered. That moment stayed with me longer than the entire awards night. So no, I wasn't embarrassed anymore. I had simply given too much to someone who never looked back. And now, I had chosen someone who looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you." Sometimes, it's not about being seen under the lights. It's about being remembered when the room goes dark. And for the first time in years, I walked home not as a shadow behind someone else, but as a woman who finally stepped back into her own story.